The summer Dela Hartley turned down $40,000, the whole county decided she'd lost her mind. The check was real. The buyer was serious. All she had to do was let them bulldoze one crooked line of old trees running across her best field. 8 acres of wasted ground, they called it, and plant it edge to edge like everybody else. She tore the offer up at the kitchen table and went back to bed. 3 men watched that tree line from the gravel road and shook their heads. And not one of them, not the banker, not the seed dealer, not the neighbor who'd farmed 40 years, could have guessed why she did it. Because Dela wasn't protecting trees, she was setting a trap. And in 90 days, the sky was going to spring it. If you've ever been the youngest person in the room, talked over, waved off, told you were too green to know anything, this story is going to feel personal. Do me one favor. Tap subscribe before you forget. Not for me. For every version of you that people counted out too early. Now, let me take you back to the spring nobody saw it coming. To understand why a row of trees made grown men angry, you have to understand the country Dela farmed. This is the open plains, Nebraska, edge of the Corn Belt. Land so flat you can watch a truck drive for 20 minutes before it reaches you. And out here, land is everything. Every acre you don't plant is money you don't make. So when equipment got bigger and margins got thinner, farmers started doing the same thing all across the Midwest. They ripped out the windbreaks. Those long rows of trees, shelterbelts they're called, had been planted generations back after the Dust Bowl to stop the wind from carrying the topsoil clean off the land. But by Dela's time, most folks saw them as obstacles. They blocked the big sprayers. They ate up plantable ground. One by one across the county, the old tree lines came down. Everyone tore theirs out. Dela kept hers, and not just kept it. That spring, she started fixing it, filling the gaps with new saplings, widening it, spending money, and weeks of work on the one thing the whole county had agreed was worthless. Now ask yourself, what does a 22-year-old know that 40-year farmers don't? Here's the truth most of them never bothered to learn. The wind out there isn't random. It has habits, it has a direction it loves, a corner it always hits first, a speed it builds across open ground with nothing to slow it down. And the question none of those men thought to ask was the one Dela had been chewing on all winter. What happens to a windstorm when it slams into a wall it didn't expect was there. She intended to find out. Dela Hartley grew up on that farm the way some kids grow up in a language they don't realize they're learning. Her grandfather, Walt, taught her to read the sky before she could read a book. Her father took over when Walt passed, worked it quiet and careful, never got rich, never lost it either. Then her father's lungs started failing him the winter she turned 21. And without any big speech about it, Dela started doing more, then most, then all of it. The men on the road didn't see a farmer when they looked at her. They saw a girl in over her head, running a place she was too young to hold on to. What they didn't know was that the winter before, cleaning out the old equipment shed, she'd found a wooden box. Inside it, her grandfather's notebooks, decades of them, not just yields and rainfall, sketches, wind diagrams, little drawings of how snow piled up behind the tree line, where the soil stayed put, where it always blew away. And in one notebook, a passage she read so many times she could say it with her eyes closed. The trees aren't in the way. The trees are the reason the dirt's still here. Pull them, and you'll see. First big blow that comes, the field will get up and walk off without you. Could a dead man's handwriting, 60 years old, really beat the entire county's best judgment? Dela didn't know yet. But she trusted Walt more than she trusted the men laughing on the road. So she did her homework. She drove to the county extension office. She pulled up the dry, technical research papers. And there it was, in scientist language, the exact thing her grandfather had written, by lamplight. A shelter belt slows wind for a distance of up to 10 times its height. It breaks the gusts before they reach the crop. It keeps the soil home. It can be the difference between a field that bends and a field that snaps. She didn't use the fancy words when she told her father. She just sat on the edge of his bed and said, "Grandpa Walt left those trees on purpose, and I think I finally get why." Her father looked at her a long time. Then he nodded. He trusted her. Almost nobody else did. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because over the next few months, the worst-case version of the wind her grandfather warned about, the kind that only shows up once in a generation, was quietly forming 1,000 miles away. And it was heading straight for Dela's county. She had no idea. She was just doing the work. But the clock had already started. June came in hot and stormy, the way it does on the plains. Ordinary thunderstorms rolled through every few days. Nothing scary, nothing anyone marked on a calendar. But Dela started watching something nobody else watched. After every storm, before she did anything else, she'd walk the downwind side of her tree line. She'd check the corn, and every single time she saw the same thing. On the open fields, her neighbors' fields, the wind had leaned the stalks hard, beaten the young plants flat in patches, left bare dirt drifting at the low end. Behind her tree line, the corn stood up straight, calm, like it hadn't even noticed the storm. One afternoon, old Burl Simmons slowed his truck on the road and hollered something across the field, something about how those trees were going to be real pretty when the bank took the farm. Dela just raised a hand and kept walking. Inside, something was building. Not pride exactly. More like watching a long math problem start to come out even. The numbers were lining up. But these were just thunderstorms, little tests. And Dela knew, somewhere out past where she could see, the real exam was coming. The word started moving on a Sunday. The meteorologists had a name for it, and the name alone made experienced farmers go quiet, a derecho. If you've never heard that word, and most people hadn't until recently, a derecho is a wall of wind, not a tornado that touches down and lifts. A straight-line storm 100 miles wide that races across the land at highway speed, with gusts strong enough to flatten a cornfield like a boot on dry grass. Out here they call what it does to corn green snap. The stalks don't bend, they break. And this one was forecast to come in from the northwest, the exact direction Walt's notebooks had circled and underlined 60 years before. The whole county went into the grim rhythm of people who've been here before. They moved machinery into sheds. They tied down what they could. They drove their fields one last time, looking at the tall green corn, doing the math. Nobody says out loud, "How much can I lose before this year is gone?" Dela moved through a list she'd made back in March. She got her father settled. She checked the new saplings. And that night, with the first far-off rumble shaking the windows, her father asked her from his chair, "You ready?" She looked out at the tree line, black against a sky gone the color of a bruise. "I guess we're about to find out," she said. It hit at sunrise. The sound came first, a freight train roar with no train. Then the wall arrived. Dela stood at her kitchen window and watched the open ground go down. Her neighbor's corn, acres and acres of it, flattened in seconds, the way wheat goes down under a scythe. The wind picked up loose topsoil and turned the morning brown. Outbuildings lost their roofs. A grain bin 2 farms over peeled open like a tin can. The derecho did not care how hard anyone had worked, and then it reached the Hartley tree line. The trees bent. They groaned. A few old branches tore loose and tumbled across the field. Dela's grandfather had never promised the trees would stop the storm, and they didn't. Nothing stops a derecho. But they slowed it, exactly the way the notebook said, exactly the way the research said. The wall of wind hit that 60-year-old wall of trees and broke apart over the top of it, spilling its fury into the branches instead of the field. And behind the line, in the strip of ground her grandfather had drawn a circle around half a century ago, the corn shook and leaned and held. When the storm passed and the dust settled, Dela walked out into a county that had been knocked flat. And there, behind her trees, stood her crop, battered, leaning, alive. Burl Simmons lost his entire corn crop, green snap, every acre. The seed dealer lost a third of his. The neighbor who'd offered her $40,000 to cut the trees down was looking at a total loss, on the very ground he'd wanted to clear. The Hartley farm, the one everybody knew was being run by a girl too young to know better, had come through the worst storm in a generation with the least damage of any farm in the county. The trees had done exactly what a dead man's notebook said they would do 60 years after he wrote it down by lamplight and set it on a shelf for someone to find. Dela stood in the wreckage of everyone else's year and didn't feel triumph. She felt something quieter than that, something closer to gratitude, aimed at a man she barely remembered, who'd been talking to her all spring through his handwriting. They came one by one over the next 2 weeks, not in a group, not to apologize. Farmers don't really do that. They came the way people come when they need to understand something, boots still muddy, caps in their hands. Burl Simmons came first. He stood at the edge of the tree line for a long time, looking at the green corn behind it, at the bare flattened ground that was his side of the fence. When he finally turned to her, the meanness was gone out of his face. "I need you to tell me what you did here," he said. It wasn't really a question. It was an old man trying to understand why his neighbor's ground stood when his own laid down. "I didn't do anything," Dela said. "My grandfather did. I just didn't undo it." She showed them the notebooks. She showed them the research papers, lined up next to Walt's drawings, saying the same thing in 2 different languages. Nobody laughed. Nobody had anything left to laugh about. They stood in the field, serious and quiet, and listened to a 22-year-old explain something that had been sitting in a wooden box for half a century, waiting for someone to open it. Her father was on the porch the evening the last of them left. Dela sat down beside him and told him how it had gone. The men, the questions, the long, quiet looks at the tree line. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had. And when she finished, he was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked you." It wasn't a complicated thing to say. But it was the right thing, and it landed in her chest the way right things do. The next spring, 4 farms along that road planted new shelterbelts. The Extension Office ran a workshop on windbreaks that drew people from 3 counties. 2 years after the derecho, you could fly over that stretch of Nebraska and count thousands of new feet of young trees, standing where bare open ground used to be. None of it would have happened if a 22-year-old hadn't been written off as too young to know anything, and hadn't answered that, not with anger, not with an argument, but with one quiet season of work, guided by the handwriting of a man most of them never met. Here's the thing about the people who get underestimated. Everybody's so busy watching what they're not doing, the acre left unplanted, the trees left standing, that nobody notices what they're really doing, paying attention, listening to the people who came before, building a wall, quiet and patient, for a storm that hasn't shown up yet. The wind always comes eventually, and when it does, it doesn't ask how old you are. It just finds out, in about 30 seconds, whether you built the line that holds. Dela Hartley never set out to prove anyone wrong. She set out to save a farm. In the end, she saved a whole lot more than that.